My name is Brent Gatewood, and I own a company called consultIG, and I work with a couple of different partners, and governance and the rules are some of the things that we focus on as an organization. One of the gentlemen on our team is an attorney, and we probably have done legal research in over 100 countries worldwide. We're very fortunate to call some of the biggest Fortune 100 companies our clients, and we've advised them on all sorts of things as it relates to governance control sets. I'm the technology guy as it relates to their strategy, compliance. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And obviously, since we have such a small group here, if there's a particular topic that you guys want to dive a little bit deeper in, please just let me know, and we can have some of those conversations. I'll also be wandering around afterwards if you have some questions and want to just shout out. So, I skipped over it, but yes, we've got governance issues, right? And it's something that's not going to be changing anytime soon. We've got a lot of directives as it relates to the European Union. We've got a lot of directives or laws as it relates in the United States. And then as you really start to go across the world, we have many, many laws and regs. Unfortunately, as multinationals or as companies become more multinational in their business, many of those laws start to overlap and conflict with each other. So we can chat just a little bit about that as well. But obviously, since we're here in Spain, we thought maybe the good thing to do would be to start a little bit about the European Data Protection Act. I'm guessing people in the room have generally heard of this. There's several articles in it, but I think we're going to just focus on a couple of them that I think make sense in the light of Alfresco and content management and collaboration. So, Chapter 2, Article 5, we're really talking about the quality of data. And I guess one of the things that I would like us to do is to kind of keep that filter on and think about the technology that we're either implementing or talking about or learning about here at this conference. As we think about the obtaining and processing fairly and lawfully the data that we use inside of our organization. Now, in the European Union, we have a big concern about privacy and making sure that the data is properly protected. We can't do a whole lot about obtaining it. If we think through our processes inside of our company, that's usually driven by somebody else. And maybe we are from one of the departments that is actually gathering the data. But what we often find is once we start using tools like content management systems or ERP systems, that's when we can start to put some of these controls around it. And that's where we start to talk about how it is stored and how it is used. Right? As we're grabbing data or we're grabbing information, we want to make sure that we're storing it and using it for specific and legitimate purposes. And we want to be able to document and back that information up. Because that is often what we are asked to do as we talk about the information. We also want to not be excessive in our collection of information, and that kind of goes against our natural tendencies. I don't know about anybody else, but you know, if I can get this much, but if I can get that much for a buck more, you know, we usually do that sort of concept. And it's the same with our data, because we have this mentality now of big data, whereas before we used to think we would grab just the information we needed. Now everybody in the industry is telling us that big data is better. The more data we have that we can throw into a pool and start to mine, we will obviously be a much more successful company. So we have to be careful about that as we're talking about some of the data that we are collecting. Because again, we have to point to the fact that we're gathering only the information that we need and that it is accurate and current. If we talk about our systems that we have in-house, accuracy and currency is another way that we can utilize tools. We can use audit trails to make sure that the data has been refreshed at a certain time period or that it has been deleted at a certain time period. That maybe it has gone through, we've heard a lot about workflow and processes. So if we have the tool in place to document some of these items, we can make sure that we're in compliance with Chapter 2, Article 5. And I guess the last one that we want to also bring forward is preserved in a form permitting identification for no longer than required. And that is where we often have one of our challenges. That's where a lot of our clients who are multinationals have challenges, because we have two different concepts of data retention generally in the world. We have kind of a US model, if you will, which is you have to retain certain bits of information for at least X period. And then as we start to work over in the European Union, the laws start to change to where you can you can't keep information longer than X period or Y period. If it's a great day, it is X and X. Unfortunately, it's usually X and Y, and we have to figure out how to manage that delta. Article 7 is where we talk about data security, and we want to make sure that we have appropriate security. One of the things that we wanted to do in this session today was talk about some tools or some justifications that can help us justify the implementation of a system or to help us move that system through, and what are some of the things we need to pay attention to. More and more data security is becoming an issue. If we look at many of the newspapers that are around or many of the articles that hit the web, it has to do with leaks of information or it not being appropriately secured, if you want to think about that. The actual language is the appropriate security measures shall be taken for the protection of personal data stored in automated data filing systems against accidental, unauthorized destruction or accidental loss, as well as against unauthorized access, alteration, or dissemination. So again, we start to look at the tools that we have. Can we, maybe as we're deployed today, can we say we're in compliance with Article 7? Can we look at our processes and make sure that our securities have been put in place so that we can sign a piece of paper that says we are in compliance with Article 7 of Chapter 2? And I think that is one of our challenges, because we want to have audit and control tools that will enable us to point to this and say, yes, we can in fact say that our repositories are locked down, that the data within them is only accessible by the people that need to have access to it. So that may be the world's quickest flyover of a couple of items in the EU Data Protection Act. And that's because I wanted to talk about a couple other things as well. My original piece on this had other countries in it, like Argentina. I'm not sure which one made it to the web. So if one of the older versions is up there and you say, well, why is Argentina in here? I was just trying to point out different laws and different things that face us as multinationals around the world or doing business around the world. One of the pieces that we wanted to put in there was talking about France, right? The right to be forgotten, droit à l'oublier. So retention is to be determined based on purpose. All right. Now, as I start to think about rolling out, and I've helped to roll out several ECM solutions over my career, it's so much easier when you have a law that says something cannot be kept longer than X period, or something needs to be kept at least as long as Y period. But if we have to start asking our users what is a reasonable time period that we need this to perform certain activities or certain processes, that's where it becomes harder, because that also then becomes a moving target. And I think many organizations will also have two people that will tell you two completely different things. One person may want to use a piece of information for a specific task, and as I mentioned with big data, somebody may want to hold on to it for quite some time so that they can do some data mining on it. So we really have to think through that. And the French law for the right to be forgotten actually talks about not only the user requirements, but once we archive it, what are we doing with it? So if you start to think about the life cycle of the information inside of your systems, sure, we have high availability and high access requirements that we need, but then as that information starts to age, we want to put it on cheaper, slower drives. And we may actually have to get to a place where we depersonalize it. We take certain data out of it. Can we then point to it so somebody else can use it for longer term data mining, or we can use it for trending analysis? Those are many of the things that people like to use with their big data. So our data must be secured from an access, it has to be preserved, and it has to be able to be deleted upon request or directive. Okay. Now that one's also another hard one. Again, we do a lot of work with some very large organizations that have some very large ERP solutions in-house. And it's quite difficult to take a particular piece of data out of a structured database without it impacting other facets of that database or other uses of that information. So really looking at how this information is structured inside of your organization is very difficult. You know, and that's why we look at ECM tools, and you know, we've talked about and are going to hear a little bit more at this conference about EZRM from Alfresco, and that's one of the opportunities is if we can start to put the appropriate controls around the information earlier than later as we put that information in or as we design some of those repositories. And our challenge is, you know, we've got France up here, but we really need to consider all the jurisdictions where we do business, right? It's not just our country. It's not just whatever governing or federal layer we have above us, but it also starts to impact where we do business. And it's very, very specific depending on what we do in certain countries. We have many manufacturing clients that maybe only sell goods or items or services in particular countries. So the requirements for the information gathered and maintained in those countries are very different from the countries where they have manufacturing operations. And it becomes a very costly thing to manage those information assets either differently, as you go from country to country. If I have two manufacturing facilities, one in Russia and one in Central Europe, very, very different requirements on the types of information that need to be maintained. But if I have a sales operation in Russia and manufacturing in Central Europe, I don't want to have to hold on to manufacturing records per Russian regulations if I don't do any of that there. So you have to think about the types of laws that are in place and how they really affect what we're keeping. So we really could go through each of the countries around the world and talk about laws such as the right to be forgotten as it relates to personal information or corporate information. But I think in light of what's happening here in the EU, it's important to talk about one of our new considerations. There's a significant change being proposed in the European Union as it relates to data management and compliance with said data management. Now, I've stricken Data Protection Directive 9546 EC. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. But what I wanted to talk about is how the current guidance is very different from what is proposed. And that can really help us as we're trying to either go through an implementation or justify the implementation of a new system. Our current guidance really is a bit of an overlayer with a deference to each individual country as to what they want for specific requirements. Allows for data collection and, as I said, can vary country by country. Many companies, many multinationals have developed protocols for collecting the information as required in the limelight of the 9546 EC directive. They've got processes in place, they've got technologies that they've put in place, and they've vetted many solutions to make sure that they're in compliance. But as people looked at that and as they struggled with, like what I talked about earlier, where one country may have a particular law on the books or a regulation as to how long to keep information or how to keep information, the directive may have another component, or two countries may have conflicting components. What the powers that be have decided is that they need to come up with a new law. And one of the, so that, I mean, that covers our globalization component of it, but one of the main drivers of it was said to be social media. And I find that interesting. Social media is used very differently across the world. I know traditionally in the United States it has not really been used probably until the last 6 months to a year, let's say a year, as a formalized marketing tool. But we've had clients that have used it, like in South America or Europe, as a formalized marketing tool for years. So now how do we grab that information from a social media network in the venues where it's being used and make sure that we're complying with our governance rules that are in place? So that's one of the reasons that there became a there's been more and more discussion about having a pan-European law as it relates to data protection and data regulation. So that single law, the General Data Protection Regulation, has a 2014 proposed adoption date. You know, sometimes being the guy from the United States, you have to duck once in a while. Snowden is a good case, or the NSA is a good case of that. One of the reasons that we're seeing more and more traction towards this particular law and the reemergence, this Article 42, and we'll talk about it, much of the information in Article 42 was actually in the original European directive, privacy directive, and was stricken because it was seen as being too difficult to comply with. Well, some of the actions of my country have made people raise their eyebrows and say maybe we should do something about that. So again, we're looking at a 2014 adoption. We're looking at enforcement 2 years later from its adoption. The goal is to have a single set of rules. So that should, if all parties agree to it, take away some of our conflicts right out of the gate. We should now have a single proposed set of rules that we can now look to guide our data collection and our data management, if you will. And a single data protection authority, the DPA. And we'll talk about some of the responsibilities of the DPA as we talk about Article 42 here. And the reason I pulled out Article 42 specifically is because it has quite a bit to do with how we manage information. And it's going to change how we have to manage information and comply with the discovery or dissemination of that information. So Article 42 limits the collection of personal data by non-European Union states and without prior authorization. So that's very similar to what we have in place today. Many multinationals have prior authorization processes in place for their clients or for their internal customers or employees that are around the world. Because they want to make sure that they can put them, for instance, into a human resource system. Many organizations have a singular human resource system, and if they don't have a prior authorization to collect personal information, it's very difficult for them to have a centralized view as to their employees. But Article 42 may is written up there because, again, the new directive has not been passed yet, but as it's written today, it could invalidate many law enforcement requests. Okay? If you have a non-EU entity requesting information from an EU entity, they have the perfect right to stand up and say no. And if you think about multinational organizations and how they have to share information about their employees or how they have to share information about projects, if Article 42 were to go into, were to be enacted as it is currently written, it would also restrict the sharing of that personal information. So if we can no longer share that information, what does that do to our internal processes? And I think that could be quite a challenge. One of the other conversations that was, I think, in this room, actually, a couple hours ago, talked about contracts. And many of our contracts are non-disclosure agreements, could be confidentiality agreements. Article 42 would actually supersede many of those. So if you think about the process inside of your organization as you enter a relationship with another entity or maybe a contract employee, depending on where they reside and where that document is signed, you may or may not have very many controls over the information that is collected or used during that process. So we always need to step back and think about what does that mean as we're starting to identify either repositories of information or start to implement some of these systems and how we care for and secure that information. So unfortunately, for our multinational organizations, our conflicts are going to potentially continue to occur. Now, what's good for us in the European Union is if our multinational is all within the EU, this is going to really take a lot of the burden away. Assuming that everyone adopts it, and assuming that we have our 2014 adoption, we can now point to a single set of rules as we start to deploy our systems. Or as we look to the deployments that we have in-house and we look at the processes that we have for collecting and securing information, we can now go to one place as opposed to potentially looking at my country, you know, the country where I happen to reside, the other 3 that we do business with, and then an EU layer on top. This should make all of that unnecessary. But one of the things that we want to be careful is some of the broad language as it's currently proposed. Current broad language support, or purports to invalidate any judgment of a court or tribunal or decision of an administrative authority of a third country requiring a controller or processor to disclose personal information. And that goes back to that earlier statement I made where somebody could, in what would be a normal process today, make a request for information. Due to the language here, wouldn't be able to get that information. Article 42 would say, nope, the information cannot leave. So places where we've been compliant, places where we've had handshake agreements to share information in the past would not be possible today. Additional articles in there, privacy by design. Our data protection and the terminology that's in the directive as it stays right now is designed in. So that's one of the things I think if we look at it from a rollout perspective, as we look at maybe an Alfresco deployment, can we say that we have designed in our processes? The products and services, have we put our controls in place as we rolled out that tool set? And one of the other things to think about is, if this is adopted on 2014, can we do that with our current implementations? And I think that might be even one of the bigger challenges. Could our company comply today? Were our systems set up properly? Are we prepared to show our audit trails and our controls in our current environment? And I know in the United States they're really big about having somebody sign off on that once it becomes audited or auditable process. So in your current deployment, can you do that? And in a future deployment, here's a great opportunity to look to a rule set that's coming down the road and use that as guidance to make sure that we're setting up our system ready to comply. Article 33, the data protection impact assessment. So they are required to be done when a risk occurs. So we as an organization, and again we're talking about proposed language here, we as an organization identify a potential risk. It's a minor risk, but we have an obligation, if you will, to do some self-reporting on that risk. So we go through, we do an assessment, we say we've handled it, here's what we need to do to fix either our system or our process to make sure that we are in full compliance. One of my favorites is, if it is a high risk, then we have to get our data protection authority involved. Well, what's a high risk? Okay, there's no determination of that. How do we identify a high risk? How do we have that scale inside of our own organization? So that's something that we need to think about as we look at the tools and the people we have and say, can we identify what we assume to be a moderate risk and a high risk? And is our tool strong enough to stand investigation? You know, the deployment we have in place today, could it stand up to an investigation should we have either a moderate or high risk post-2014 and this act is in place? Okay. And that's something that, you know, you have to talk about with your team and talk about with how that information is used and how your deployment is currently in place. Skip over this real quick, but one of the reasons I wanted to put this in here is there's a couple of relevant points. Many of your organizations may have U.S. operations or do business in the United States. B, Some of the items from the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure do end up making their way around the world in different formats. And just to show kind of how some of this information is handled in the United States. One thing that you may or may not know, and we like to sue people in the United States. Yeah. We're very litigation heavy, all right? Truth be told, I built a house 10, 15 years ago with my wife. My neighbor sued me because he didn't like how I did my grass. And that, I swear to God, is true. He didn't think my landscaping was appropriate, so he got an attorney and came after me. He didn't ask me. So, we are litigation heavy in the United States. The Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, basically if, the quick overview here, if I as an organization, as a company, get sued, there are certain obligations I have to do, and that's kind of what the federal rules are about here. There's a duty to disclose relevant evidence, okay? Very similar to what we're talking about in the EU directive. The duty in the US is broad as well. May obtain discovery regarding non-privileged, anything that's relevant to the party's claim, okay? And I'm not going to read all of this. I want to skip over some of this, but it's just interesting to note that there are similarities between this particular component as well as the EU directive. This is interesting. A party need not provide discovery of electronically stored information from sources that the party identifies are not reasonably accessible. Okay? So one of the things that happened in the United States, again, remember, sue happy, or litigation happy, is people would just start making huge claims and requests for information that would actually cause the other organization to buckle. Say, you know, it's just too costly to provide all this information. We give. You know, we'll settle the case out of court. So this was done in a bit of a nod to stop that from happening. And I don't think that that happens in the European Union to that extent. But I think it's an interesting thing to think about as you look at how your data is stored. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means from a data map perspective. But this is the flip side of it, right? So we go through all that and we say, hey, it's too expensive, we can't get that information out. But guess what? A court can order it anyway, right? So we can actually make a case for something and a court can say, too bad, you have to find the information anyway. And that's one of the challenges inside of our organization is, can we go through this process? Do we know where our information is stored? And I think we have to start to look at that from the EU perspective as well, and the member states as well. Because as issues come forward, or as an organization is being audited, it's very reasonable in light of the new directive to be asked, where does that data reside inside of your organization? How are you securing it? If somebody's asking you, how are you securing it? How are you deleting it? The obvious question is, well, do you know where it is? And quite often, it's a little difficult for us to know where it is. This is another interesting piece that I think goes to having good systems and good controls in place up front. Routine system operation. So absent exceptional circumstances, a court may not impose sanctions under the rules to a party for failing to provide electronically stored information lost as a result of routine good faith operation. So what is routine good faith operation? Well, if I have my requirements, my retention requirements, my privacy requirements, if I've built processes around that and I have instructed my Alfresco system to go in and delete information after it has met its useful time period, as we saw earlier, or has met its legal or regulatory binding requirements, if I don't have it, I'm not being penalized for not having it. Okay? And that kind of flies in the face of, again, a human nature thing to where we hold on to things just 'cause, right? We know that we can legally get rid of something, but maybe we want to hold on to it because, boy, I looked at that once 5 years ago. Well, if we can break our users of that habit of holding on to information just because, that really lightens up the load from a risk perspective inside of our organization and from a process of auditing and actually from a data management. If we can get rid of the stuff that we have in our systems that we don't need anymore, that we don't use anymore, our systems become that much more responsive. The old disk space is cheap doesn't really apply to everything in life. It applies at home where you're saving pictures. It doesn't apply at work where you have valuable content stored. So what are the possible consequences if we fail to meet up with our EU directive, if we fail to produce some of this information? Well, any failures may lead to sanctions. Right? If somebody comes and asks for information and we can't provide it to them on a timely basis, if we can't point to controls as we're directed to, if we can't point to securities that are in-house, if we can't point to an audit log that states who had access to a particular data set at a certain time, we could be sanctioned. And sanctions, you know, that's fines. More importantly, in today's world, it's lost faith. You know, as an article or a finding is made its way public, and we have an article about it, or we have news reporting that privacy or private information was divulged. It's that loss of faith that's almost worse than the fines. And spoliation in the United States, again, from a legal perspective. If I fail to preserve information once I've been given notice, I can be fined directly or have a summary judgment, which is what I mean by default judgment. Interesting one, when Apple sued Samsung, initially 27 people were inside of Samsung. They said, well, why don't you hold on to your emails? Samsung is a large organization, right? So they knew the suit was coming. They put email holds on 27 people. Once the subpoena hit the front door, they put 2,700 people on hold. So in other words, they knew that this was coming. They only held a small fraction and let everybody else's auto-delete off the system. That cost them over $1 billion because it's what they call spoliation. They knew that there was stuff being deleted off. So we don't want to have that. So the effects on business as usual, right? Potentially significant as these directives go into force and as we're looking at how we're going to comply with them, right? We have large, intricate systems inside of our organizations. Collections are generally growing. Sometimes we have some collections that are shrinking. Hopefully we're starting to archive information off our older systems. But fundamentally, we have collections that are growing. And people want to use a system that's easy to use, right? People need to work within these systems. And I think, you know, we've had that conversation this morning. If we can set up a system so that people just do their daily job and store things in a place where I know it's going to be managed and then I can go get it again, they don't care about rules, right? They don't care about where it's stored. They don't care what the systems are. They don't care what it's called. And they don't necessarily care about the oversight. Again, if they can get to the information they need when they need it, it's our challenge as we go to put some of these systems in place to build a system that way. So, you know, as we go through, again, like an Alfresco deployment with an EasyRM module turned on, you know, if we can go through that process and give them a logical, easy place to store their information, it makes it that much better for them. Better for us because they're going to use the system. They're not going to try and get around it, right? This morning's comment from Larry, I think it was Larry. No, it was the CEO of Alfresco about his boss wanted a blog, right? So he got out his credit card and $59 later had an account. Well, we want the easy thing to be inside so that we can show ourselves in compliance with all of these rules. It is way too easy nowadays to sign up for a free account someplace or even a cheap account someplace and start to house our corporate data in those environments with little or no controls. So, our systems need to control our information. We need to look inside of our organization and say, yes, we have the proper footprint of systems, or we have that hybrid that was discussed earlier. You know, maybe because of our location and the type of information that we're housing, we need to have some on-premises hardware and software for managing some of this information. But for, to use the numbers of this morning, 60% of that information, that can be off-site in a controlled environment, though, because it's still our organization. We need to make sure that we're controlling those data assets. Our rules need to be integrated into the system itself. All right? If you remember that slide earlier, they need to be designed in to the system. So as we go through that deployment, as we look at our processes for gathering information, utilizing it, and then disseminating it, our controls need to be built into that process. Processes must be automated as much as possible. Right? Heard a couple people talk about legal. There was a discussion in here this morning about a legal group. I've done some work in law firms. If it takes more than a couple clicks, people aren't going to do it, right? If it takes me a couple more clicks than I'm comfortable with to save a document, I'm not going to save it in that repository. I'm going to figure out a way to save it on my hard drive, or I'm going to figure out a way to throw it in Dropbox or Box or something like that. So if I can automate as much as this process, if I can give people logical storage places, you know, a folder where I put particular types of information, and then on the background it inherits all of that information, it inherits a classification or it inherits a privacy code or something along those lines, and then can act on that later in the object's life, perfect, because I'm probably not going to do it. So we focus on our individuals need to be focused on their job. They need to focus on collaboration. Again, that's where suites like this are very handy. And they don't need to worry about rules. So how do we prepare? How do we get ourselves ready for this environment? Well, as I mentioned, we try to bake it in as much as possible. All right. It's been called records management for a long time. Information governance is kind of a new terminology for it. Spans more than just records. I am a certified records manager. Should have mentioned that earlier. Certified records manager, kind of the techie geek guy, so I'm the life of the party. Everybody wants to talk about technology and records management. But if we have those controls in place, we bake them in, we can really start to look at the classification structure and search tools. Sorry, I was going down information governance path, wasn't I? So information governance, the reason that I like information governance and where I started to go there, records, I don't think records matter anymore, all right? And that gets me kicked out of a lot of really exciting parties. Because I think it's all information, right? People used to be hung up on managing records in a particular way. Well, I think you have to kind of treat everything in that particular way. Because if you look at some of these directives that are coming down the pike, they're not asking you to, well, once it's declared a record, do this, this, and this with it. They're saying this is sensitive information, or this is information worthy of being protected. I don't care if it's a record or not. You need to protect it and manage it in these manners. And I think we have to shift how we wear that hat sometimes as records managers inside of organizations and start to really look at information management, information governance from a broader perspective. Because all information needs to be classified. It all has to have some structure associated with it. All right? And once we start to do that, we can really start to utilize other controls. Search tools probably doesn't belong under records management controls, but yet it does. Having a robust search engine that can start to search on metadata as well as the document itself is fantastic. And once we can start to fine-tune those searches because of the metadata that's associated with it, that's even better yet. So if we've got our classification and our structure in place, searching becomes much better. Using that information becomes much easier. And then, of course, disposition, the point where we start to get rid of everything, right? Because that's our goal. There's very little information inside of an organization that needs to be held on to for a really long time, and almost nothing that needs to be held on to forever, unless you're in a highly regulated environment. You know, we have clients that run nuclear power plants. All right, their stuff needs to be held on to for a long time. But if I'm making widgets, typically not real long retention periods. And if I have personally identifiable information, very short retention periods, especially over here. So, integrate our governance controls early when the systems are purchased. Take advantage of upgrade cycles to do it at that point. Take advantage of deployments to new departments. Take advantage of large projects inside of your organization. I was working with a company one time that they were rolling out a new desktop interface to all of their users. What a great time to bake in some of these controls we're talking about. Again, the end user may not even know what's happening. Just they're storing the information in a new place. We know from a governance perspective that now we're putting the proper controls in place too. When databases are designed, that's one of the ickiest ones. And I say icky. You know, as we start to deploy some of these large databases, or as we start to deploy some of these structured data sets, if we can bake those rules in up front, that's just much better in the long run for us. Going back in and trying to go through 1,000 or 10,000 SAP tables and look at rows and columns trying to figure out how we can cut data, and then figuring out how we can archive particular data sets without impacting system performance in another way is a challenge. If we can have some of those conversations up front, even better. Integrate our records management and ITIS into the process. I mean, really chat with our users and understand how they use it. I mean, because, you know, and I'm guilty of this. You get a new tool or a new toy, you want to rip the cellophane off and hit install and go. But as we start to talk about some of these larger deployments, we want to really make sure we understand our users' processes, define our controls. And I mentioned this earlier, map the data. You know, in the United States, because of the federal rules of civil procedure, it's paramount to really understand what is where. But as we look at some of the directives around the world, the same is the case. Where is that personal data stored? Where is some of that information that has higher regulatory requirements? Where is it stored? Who has access to it? Where is it logically stored? Where is it physically stored? I mean, that's one of the things that we find as a real issue inside of managing our data sets. There's a lot of resources out there that we can take a peek at from a technically challenging perspective, from fascinating reading, but the model requirements, MOREC, I'm not sure if people are familiar with MOREC, deals with a lot of our systems, what sorts of requirements our systems need to have, what compliance sets are available. If you're looking at acquiring either modules or something, MOREC is a great place to look at different capability sets, so would recommend that. COBIT, Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. ISO 15489, a great standard as it relates to records management and some of the tools and controls that are in place. And then there's an organization, it's an international organization, but it's mostly in the United States, called ARMA. And they came out with something called the Principles, so generally accepted record-keeping principles. And those will give a view into best practices and how to manage information. And so you can start to look at some of these, and there are others as well, tool sets or documentation sets that can really help guide through that process of acquiring or implementing a new product and giving rules and giving guidance for compliance, which is, I think, the most important. And with that, does anyone have any questions, or I thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. There's a question here. You can just shout it out. I'll repeat it.
I work for the Irish Revenue. One of my responsibilities is the FIG leak system for corporate record management.
Okay.
I'm struggling to identify in the business who should be the record librarian.
So kind of the owner of individual record series, or just the person who's in charge of records management? Right.
We have a system which is voluntarily used, quite a small system.
Okay.
I'm looking to, what is the title of what kind of business person should I be looking at the organization to say, like, you need to tell me what should be done, who's responsible.
Okay. So the question is, where does this, if I may paraphrase, probably at a higher, where does records management fall inside of an organization? And
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I can't develop IT or justify IT expenditure unless I can find a business owner.
right.
Where do I find that business owner?
So who is the business owner inside of the organization to help justify some of these processes, or tool costs, or even just process costs? That's hard. It really depends. We've seen a major shift. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was all facilities. Records management was all facilities because it was dealing with shelving units and boxes and all of that. And as we've moved towards electronic records, we've seen it generally fall into two areas. One is directly with IT or IS inside of your organization. The other is legal and compliance. Now, working for the government, you probably don't have a large legal/compliance arm. Oh, you do? Oh, all right.
I mean, I'm not saying we're not fulfilling our obligations,
Right.
but I can't actually find somebody
To,
who will sponsor future development.
yeah, what we traditionally find in the States is more and more people going under legal compliance, to be quite honest with you. And that's generally pretty good because legal and compliance inside of organizations usually has no budget, but also has an open checkbook once you can justify a case. At least that's what we see.
We have a whole arm of lawyers
Yeah.
directly employed by ourselves. I hadn't thought of them. They may be motivators.
Sure, because when legal stands up and says we have to do something because we are at risk or whatever the case might be, generally people find the funds or find the momentum to start a project. And I think people rushed into the IT groups at first, especially for a while IT groups had kind of limitless budgets, right? Because they just told people we have to do this, and people gave them money, and that has been ramped back. So from a budgeting perspective, IT isn't quite as strong as they used to be, which is why I think we're seeing more people on the legal and compliance side of the house. So, sure. Okay. Right. Yeah, well, we've seen that as well. So, maybe the function of records management is under legal. I have traditionally called it like a records advisory group or records advisory committee, where you try to get as many heads as appropriate. There's always that fine line of the right number and the right people, of course. But with that committee, they're the ones that take on ownership of direction, right? So maybe you bring to that committee, and it sounds like you kind of do this. You bring, yeah. Uh-huh. Yep. Right. Because if you can drive a project to that level, and then give their approval, to your point, now you have marching orders. And exactly, exactly. Yeah, what we usually try to do, or what we recommend in a scenario like that, is if there are, let's just say you have 5 members that are always on that committee, and then you have a couple of floating members depending on the concerns at that particular time. So, and it's different for every organization because of what you do. Are you services oriented? Are you manufacturing oriented? Are you a government agency? But if you can have kind of a stable of upper management that is always a part of that committee, but maybe you have some people that float on and off, if it's a big operational issue, then you can bring somebody in and even get their buy-in too. So that's kind of one of the recommendations I've made in the past. So. Yes? So the question is, as more and more information goes to the cloud, does that change much of this? Again, paraphrasing?
It's not just the cloud, it's also just outsourcing.
Outsourcing. You have to be even more careful as you start to outsource. And one of the ways that we traditionally outsource right away, and he's actually speaking later today, is Amazon or some of the large hosters of information, is you really need to look at and understand how those organizations, whether it be an outsourced entity or whether it be a cloud-based, software as a service or somebody like that, how they're storing and managing your information. And I was part of a standards committee, and we wrote up a standard on that in the United States. It's very concerning when you start to talk with some of these vendors as to what they will commit to and not commit to. Take personally identifiable information or personal privacy. They will generally say, yes, we will delete certain data sets after X time period. And then when you ask them, can you ensure that that information has actually been deleted or destroyed, then they start to get a little squishy, to be quite honest with you. As recent as a couple of years ago, I sat down with one vendor, and he would not, in the end, commit because of the data farms that they have, the disaster recovery and continuity planning that goes into place, so the systems that they have behind their data farms to ensure 99.99% uptime, also means that data resides in multiple locations. And maybe they can say, without a doubt, we've scrubbed it from our farm. But they start to hedge a bit when you ask them about their DRCP or their third-party folks in the back. So we really recommend a true understanding of going through that.
As a small organization,
right.
My organization has 450 employees. As a small organization, when you ask questions like that to Amazon, Microsoft, Google, then they just laugh at you. They say, well, here's the standard documentation, buzz off, and that's it. Take it or leave it.
Right, and sometimes what you have to do is leave it. In the most egregious worst case scenario. But what you're going to find, and I had a conversation with a former client of mine who's going to one of the 3 you mentioned. And certainly. And I'm available after if anybody wants. These topics are coming up more and more often. And she floored me when she said one of those 3 was sitting down at the table to really discuss how they could manage that aspect, how they could manage that. Now, she's a large company, but 3 years ago, they would have said, here's our end user license agreement. If you don't like it, don't sign it. And so they're at least having that conversation today. But to your exact scenario, worst case scenario, you have to look for another vendor. Next case is you can ask for maybe a private cloud implementation. Because once you're in a private cloud, you have better controls.